everyone. Welcome to session 2 of The Essentials. I'm so glad to be here with David. What are we doing in this text this morning?
Yeah, so this is the second time we're getting together. I'll remind you, I know we've jumped from Kings all the way to Daniel, but we kind of need to jump around in order to really get the scene or the lay of the land for this topic of exile restoration. So we're today in the first chapter of Daniel, and in this first chapter, it's really just the story of Daniel being taken into exile. You'll remember, if you've read it, it's actually pretty capturing. The story itself is pretty exciting to read, I think, at the beginning. And Daniel and his friends have been taken away. They're that first group of exiles from the southern kingdom. So remember, back about 100 years or so ago, the northern kingdom is already taken away by the Assyrians. And so I just imagine what that must feel like. You know, there's the southern kingdom, their brothers and sisters from the north, they're gone. There's probably a sense of, fear, trepidation. And then all of a sudden Nebuchadnezzar comes in and he sacks the city. And then he takes all of the most sort of upper class, the leadership of Israel, he captures them forcibly and then takes them all away. So Daniel is one of those people. And in fact, you'll read this in chapter 1. Daniel and his friends, they're from royal lineage. So that means they're the seed of David. And what's important about that is not only is that pointing all the way back to think the heyday of Israel's life as a kingdom with David, but even in the broader scriptural story, that's going all the way back to this sort of kingly lineage that you'd think of as like Adam in the Garden of Eden. So
Sure.
They're being captured, swallowed up by this empire. Think of them almost like a monster. And in fact, in the visions, when you see all of these monsters of chaos, that's what it's talking about. They're being swallowed into the belly of the beast, so to speak. And they're taken into exile, and then they're forced into this position where they're almost being trained to be like Babylonians. So they learn their customs, they learn their language, all of that sort of thing, and so they have been reassigned. They're Israelites who are living in a foreign land, and they're assigned to be like brainwashed, so to speak, culturally into Babylon.
Wow. David, I was reading this text and I'm wondering, what is the deal with the food?
Yeah. If you read this, you'll notice when they're taken into service under the king. You read this in verse 8. It says, Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine. I want you to think of your favorite, most delicious Middle Eastern restaurant. Think lamb and maybe even gyros and spices and that sort of thing. Daniel that's like Babylonian cuisine, all these rich, delicious foods. Daniel's saying, I'm not going to eat those foods. I'm going to, in a way, fast.
Wow.
From being part of all of this. So on a sort of plain sense, or you might say a kind of literal level, that's what's going on. Okay. Daniel's saying, we're not going to be part of your thing,
right,
in your culture of extravagance. But the other thing that's going on, I think, is if you think back on, you can think of all of these tests that Daniel and his friends are given. We'll jump forward eventually to the lion's den and the fiery furnace. These are like temptations, so to speak. And again, I think this makes sense in Genesis as well. What's the first temptation for Adam and Eve? It's food.
Right.
But it is sort of ironic because it's reversed too. Here he's saying, I'm not going to eat all of your meats and your extravagant food. I'm only going to eat like an Eden diet.
Yeah.
He's only eating vegetables and that sort of thing. But this is their first great test as exiles in the land of Babylon. They're saying we're not only we're not going to be part of your culture, but we're committed to our God. And so the question is, will they survive? Can they do it?
Right.
And of course, we see that God does provide.
Right.
They go
Right.
for days, 14 days without
Yeah.
eating their food. And it's really fascinating the way some of this stuff maps on to all of the stories and
That's
sort
like
of figures before.
one of the most beautiful parts of the Bible is how interwoven and alive it
Yeah.
feels in those moments. Yeah.
And you'll see, I mean, we'll see that all throughout Daniel.
Yeah. How does this fit into the broader biblical story?
Yeah. Yeah, again, I mean, to the point of the interconnectedness of all of Scripture, I do think as we engage with the very opening details of this whole saga, Daniel and his friends, and ongoing exile, I'd encourage you to think about the way Israel is always under this sort of attack of becoming not God's people. There's always this temptation to become not God's people anymore, whether it be through idolatry. The story that I think shows this maybe the best is even at the very beginning of Israel's coming into the promised land. What's the great temptation? That they just become like all of their neighbors.
Sure.
So that's what's going on here as well, but on this extravagantly huge scope. So Israel's calling to be this particular people again and again is challenged and threatened, not just by like outside invading powers, but by Israel herself wanting to be like other nations.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so this is that story writ large, because you have to remember, once again, we're reading just Daniel and the sort of stories that fit along with it, but all of the prophetic literature, this is like a third of the Old Testament, is all about this. So we're exploring this huge cosmic theme of how can God's people remain faithful to him and remain faithful to their calling to be the distinct God's people in a world that just wants to gobble them up.
Yeah. Yeah. So this feels like big history,
Yeah.
big ideas. How is this translated into takeaways for our actual everyday lives?
Yeah. Yeah. You know, it's funny. I actually think that question is harder than it sounds. But
Yeah.
I think it's one of those questions that I would encourage you to explore, because you will find the more and more you engage with this material, you'll be like, oh, that kind of reminds me of when I did whatever it was. It'll resonate with your life if you let it. But in a general way, the thing I'd encourage us to think about is just the way in which we do live as exiles in a world that is at the very least unconcerned with the goings on of our callings as Christians, and perhaps at the most, downright aggressive toward it. Now that can be taken, I think, in some ways that are probably not always helpful, a kind of culture war attitude maybe. And yet, I do want us to consider, what does it look like to be a people who are distinct in a world that is often, let's face it, quite violent.
Right. Totally.
So what does it look like to be a people of peace and faithfulness
I love it.
in a world that is quite chaotic?
I love it.
And Daniel and his friends, I think, show us the way toward that. They at the very least gesture towards some responses that are helpful, which are, don't trust that.
Yeah.
Trust in God.
I think that's a great takeaway, and we're excited for you all to discuss this in your group and come up with some of your own takeaways. How is this scripture speaking to you in your life right now? David, this has been so much fun.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks.
Appreciate it. And
Yeah.
thanks for coming.
Yeah.